Good evening everybody, my name's Dave, thanks for joining me, and tonight what we're going to do is we're going to intro another video. I'm sorry about the AI voice, but I quite like it. Better than listening to me drone on. Welcome to the Old Photography School. Today's presentation is a video on focusing. I made this video around 10 years ago, but it remains current. After you've seen the presentation, if you have any questions, please let me know, I'll attempt to answer them. For FYI, the next video will be about shooter priorities, and I call it Get Your Priorities Right.
Welcome to the Old School Photography classes. Tonight's video is about sharpness. Sharpness tutorial. Why photographs aren't always sharp. Why we will cover sharpness tonight. The idea of tonight is not to get everyone completely clued up on focus. No. The idea is to get you thinking about what the issue might be, and then hopefully that will help you identify the problem you are having. Generally, at the club we have our fair share of unsharp images which we usually see on competition nights. This is not unique to WCC. Also, looking at some of the images on the club's gallery site, it is fairly obvious that there are some sharpness issues amongst the members' images. To work out how to get sharp images, you first have to know why they aren't sharp in the first place, and we'll try to address that tonight. Please don't get downhearted about this, because all of us, and I do mean all of us, are affected by blurred images. Even the professionals get them. Also, don't think that all blurred images are bad. This can also be an artistic choice by the photographer. However, there are a considerable number of images that aren't sharp, and if they were sharp, the club could use them in inter-club competitions and you might get your 15 minutes of fame. Here's some proof of blurred images. This is an image I took during a visit to Nelson Bay, just off Shark Island on central coast of NSW. As you can see, it is a nice image of a humpback whale breaching the water surface. But what you don't see are these blurred images. So why are we talking about sharpness tonight? One of the members was having some issues with sharpness, so I offered to do a talk about it. I had a look at the image with the sharpness problem and it had me a little perplexed. As you will see later, we can usually see what went wrong by examining the image. In this case, I couldn't work out what went wrong. Everything looked to be blurred, but the image didn't have the characteristics of movement blur. A quick look at the EXIF data of the image revealed the issue. It was from a mobile phone and it had been expanded way beyond this size. What Samsung is not telling you at the end of this statement is, as long as you don't want to view it any bigger than on your phone screen. A quick note on phone cameras. In today's phone wars, the camera is the only battleground left, and marketing plays a big part in the promotion of those cameras, making people believe that they can do anything. In my experience, phone cameras take great images in certain scenarios, and those scenarios are where the marketing concentrates most of its efforts. You know, the shot of the guy bouncing the basketball or the group of young people on a beach. Where these cameras do not work that well is in the world of the photographer. Don't take this the wrong way. I have seen competitions won with a phone camera image. It can be done. But the way in which they are held at arm's length and the location of the button, etc., all add to not getting very sharp images. Also, all my career I have lugged around huge lenses so that I can get sharp shots. I was always told the cheaper the lens, the worse quality the shot will be. That as a rule is mainly correct, i.e. you can't take brilliant shots with a tiny sensor, tiny lenses, and a lot of processing. But, and it is a big but, the images on a smartphone are designed to be taken and shared where nobody looks at the picture anywhere but on another smartphone, so it doesn't matter what they look like when they are zoomed in. As soon as you try to do other things with a smartphone image, such as showing it on a bigger screen, they usually start to fall apart pretty quickly. Like anything else, they have their place, and usually that's not in the photography world. If it was, and given the number of smartphones there are, we'd see many more entered into competitions, but we don't, and there is a reason for that. Back to sharpness and what we can't control. There are reasons for poor image sharpness that we can't easily fix, and these are usually because of a technical problem or an equipment shortfall. Here are some examples of this, but this is not an exhaustive list. The kit lenses that come with new cameras, for example, often produce poor images due to their cheaper build quality. There are exceptions to this, such as the nifty 50 Canon 50mm f1.8 lens. Certain zoom lenses can perform poorly at their extremes, especially when they try to cover too much range from wide to narrow, for example 18 to 300mm. There is also broken or malfunctioning equipment. These issues can only normally be overcome by replacing, upgrading, or repairing the broken device. There is also another issue where a lens can back or front focus, but that is a very technical fix and we won't be discussing that particular issue tonight. Now, what we can control. There are several reasons for blurred shots and they will be listed below. These problems are usually caused by a lack of knowledge, experience, or an outside influence, but they can be overcome once identified. However, identifying the problem is usually where people fall down, because if you don't know why it is happening, then you can't fix it. Some of the issues that can cause blurred images are shutter speed too slow, camera movement or camera shake, depth of field too narrow, high ISO and cropping, focusing on the wrong subject, focusing system set on an incorrect mode, subject moved after focus was achieved, focusing changed when recomposing the shot, camera too close to the subject and the release without focus is turned off. In some cases, having stabilization on whilst on a tripod. Shutter speed too slow. Just a quick point about camera shake versus motion blur. Camera shake is where the camera moves. Motion blur is where the subject moves, and they're two very different things. In this article, I'm focusing just on camera shake. In other words, where you photograph a static subject such as a landscape or seated portrait with a handheld camera. Getting moving shots of speeding cars is another skill altogether. Blurred images due to a slow shutter speed normally occur when hand-holding cameras and the light is low. Regardless of how well you hold it, if it moves at all while the shutter is open, the image will be blurred. This is likely the biggest cause of blurred shots for most photographers, especially beginners. For example, using a 400mm lens at 1/30th second will likely cause blurred shots. This is because we cannot hold the camera steady enough for 1/30th second duration, and therefore this movement or shake manifests itself as a blurred image, and the longer the focal length, the worse this becomes. Image stabilization will help, but is not the be-all and end-all of focusing. These images are normally completely blurred all over with nothing sharp at all. This is shown in the next image. In the left side of the next image, the camera has moved sufficiently in the 1/80th second to cause the image to be soft, blurred. In the right image, the 1/200th second is sufficient to capture a much sharper image. Even though the camera may have moved the same in the left image as it did in the right image, the faster shutter speed means that the camera hasn't moved as far whilst the shutter was open, therefore it creates less blur and the image appears sharp. The focal length versus shutter speed rule. Explained with the snooker cue analogy, the longer lenses such as 100mm or greater, the movement is exaggerated greatly at the subject end. Even when the far end is moving around like a stabbed rat, the held end is very still. In the days of film photography, there was a general rule that in order to get sharp images from a handheld camera, the shutter speed needed to be at least 1 second divided by the focal length of the lens. So the layman's method of using this would be, when hand-holding your camera, the shutter speed should match or exceed the lens focal length. In other words, if you wanted a sharp, shake-free shot with a 50mm lens, your shutter speed would be 1/50th second or faster. This rule is generally still true today, but whilst that was fine in its day, the world has moved on and so has the rule, and it needs updating. Modern lenses and cameras are capable of recording very fine detail, and as we all like to zoom in close, we view our images with a more critical eye. Add to the mix all the different sensor sizes that will alter the effective zoom of the lens, and you'll understand why the old rule needs updating. The new focal length versus shutter speed rule. Crop sensors make this equation very hard indeed. In film days, images with 35mm and a full frame is 35mm. However, if a lens has 50% cropping, Nikon, it will change the lens whatever focal length to double that. This means that camera shake will not be correct, so for a 50mm times 2 lens, it will need to be 1/100th of a second to remain sharp. To put that into the layman's terms of real-world photography, if you were using a 10mm fisheye, you could effectively shoot all the way down at 1/20th second shutter speed. If you were shooting with a 400mm lens, you would need a whopping 1/800th second shutter speed, which might be tricky and brings us on to the next point. Image stabilization. Now, having worked all of that out, we can almost disregard this information if we have image stabilization or vibration reduction in our lens or camera body. What these systems do is attempt to counteract camera shake by moving a group of lenses using sensors that detect movement. In earlier lenses, Canon state that you would be able to shoot handheld 2 stops slower than normal. With the later lenses, they claim that you can achieve up to 5 stops slower, although it is likely that in reality it is 3 or 4 stops. What this means is that you can achieve handheld shots at slower shutter speeds. For example, when using a 100mm lens without stabilization on a full-frame camera, we know that we need a shutter speed of 1/100th with the old rule and 1/200th with the new. However, if that lens has stabilization that can reduce the shake by up to 4 stops, then theoretically, we only need a shutter speed of 1/24th or 1/50th of a second on a 50% crop camera, or 1/6th to 1/12th of a second on a full-frame camera. Camera movement, camera shake. This is a very similar problem to what's defined in the previous subject of camera movement, and it can definitely be caused by the slow shutter speed mentioned above. However, there are a number of other things that can cause movement of the camera other than hand holding, and I'd like to start explaining this with a story. One night shoot in Melbourne. We were at Birrong Ma by the Yarra River shooting night shots of the Prince's Bridge. I was helping out with some of the less experienced members when I was asked by an established photographer to give them a hand. He said to me, "Try as I might, I cannot get sharp shots. Can you see what I'm doing wrong?" After checking out the camera settings and the mounts on the tripod for rigidity, I asked the photographer to go through the actions of taking a shot. It only took one shot to see the problem, but I asked him to take several just to ensure that this was the consistent problem. What was happening was as soon as he used the remote release and took the shot, he grabbed a tripod leg to steady himself and wait for the exposure to end. He was not aware that he was doing this, and this was what was causing the camera to shake and give him a blurred image. Other issues can be the wind blowing the camera on a tripod, or the tripod stood on unstable ground such as a wooden walkway, soft vegetation, or a floating jetty, especially when people are moving about or water is very rough. Another common cause is using the shutter button instead of a remote release on a longer focal length lens. To see why this is the case, mount your camera onto a tripod with your longest lens. Extend it to full zoom and then switch on live view. Now zoom in the live view as far as possible and then whilst watching the LCD screen touch the camera, and this will show you how much movement occurs. Luckily for you, I have done this for you. Depth of field too narrow Part 1. Depth of field is the most technical of the focusing issues listed here, and to explain what depth of field is, it is the amount of the photograph from front to back that is an acceptable focus. This is a very common issue, and it can be due to a lack of understanding regarding depth of field and the relationships between distance to subject and aperture. If you don't have enough depth of field, then your subjects may not be in focus as in the image to the right. The lady is in absolutely acceptable focus, but her partner is not. Obviously, we would know what settings we had used had this been taken by us, however. We are not sure in this case because the image came from the internet. Question: what do you think is the easiest step to take to get the couple both into focus? Answer is get both subjects onto the same focal plane. Depth of field too narrow Part 2. Commonly, close-up or macro photography creates the situation where the image has very little in focus. This is due to the characteristics of the lens, the aperture, and the distance to subject. All of these contribute to this problem. Learning to manage focus points or manually focusing is essential to get what you want in focus and therefore an acceptable shot. This is not really a tutorial to explain how depth of field works, however. Here is a description and some diagrams, etc. At the end of it, you should have a better understanding on how depth of field works. These two will decrease the depth of field, less in focus. Getting closer to the subject. Using a wide aperture, smaller number. These two will increase depth of field, more in focus. Getting further away from the subject. Using a narrower aperture, larger number. For example, a narrow aperture, f/16, and a large distance to subject will give you an enormous depth of field as long as the distance to subject is large enough. In contrast to this, a wide aperture and short distance to subject will give you an extremely narrow depth of field, even if the subject is within 3 or 4 meters. Depth of field too narrow Part 3. Here are some charts that attempt to show the changes to the depth of field when any of the variables are changed. I have used a 5D with a full frame sensor to create these tables, therefore. Figures may vary depending on the camera used, as this is only a guide to show how the changes affect depth of field. So why do these changes affect the depth of field? Focal length does not change the depth of field. Please note that whilst you may have heard that focal length affects depth of field, it is a misconception. Focal length only changes the way we see the bokeh, blur, as opposed to changing the depth of field. For example, if the depth of field in our picture is quite shallow using a 70mm focal length and the background is blurred, and we then switch the lens to a 200mm focal length, the background in the next picture will be a lot more blurred. Over the years, people assumed that the depth of field was decreasing because of the increased blur, but in reality, the depth of field stays the same. What changes is the magnification. The 200mm magnifies the blur in the background and gives the impression that depth of field is changing, but in reality, it remains more or less the same. Depth of field too narrow, part 4. I have some diagrams here courtesy of Martin Bailey Photography, which I think explain the theory of depth of field well and are the best I found. Yes, I asked if I could use them. He said yes. Please do not look at this entire image. All I want is for you to see the red text and the blue line angles. Yes, the other words are important, but do not confuse yourself. In this image, we have a 50mm lens using an aperture of f2.8 with a distance to subject of 2 meters. You can see by the red text that the depth of field is 27 centimeters or 0.27 of a meter, and that the sharp area is located where the blue lines converge. In fact, it is the convergence of those blue lines that dictate the depth of field, as we will see in the next slide. Depth of field too narrow, part 5. In this image, we again have a 50mm lens, but this time the aperture is f5.6 with a distance to subject of 2 meters. You can see by the red text that the depth of field has increased to 54 centimeters or 0.54 of a meter, and that the sharp area is again located where the blue lines converge. Notice how the blue lines are now closer together when they leave the lens. Because the blue lines have a reduced angle, they come together earlier and stay together longer. Remember, if this is too confusing, then look only at the red text and the blue line angles. On to the next slide. Depth of field too narrow, part 6. In this image, we again have a 50mm lens, but now the aperture has been closed down to f11 with a distance to subject of 2 meters. You can see by the red text that the depth of field has now increased to 114 centimeters or 1.14 meters, and that the sharp area is again located where the blue lines converge. Notice how the blue lines are now even closer together when they leave the lens. Because the blue lines have a reduced angle even more, they now come together much earlier and stay together a lot longer. Red text tells us what the differences are. Slide. Depth of field too narrow, part 7. This time we still have a 50mm lens and the aperture is back to f5.6, but the distance to subject has been increased to 5 meters. Now the red text tells us that the depth of field is now 379 centimeters or 3.79 meters, and that the sharp area is still located where the blue lines converge. In the previous image where we used f5.6, the lines didn't stay together very long because of the wider aperture. However, this time, although the aperture is wide, the lines stay together even longer. This is because the subject is further away and the lines have to travel further to the subject, making the angle shallower, so the lines get closer together as they stretch out to the subject. Depth of field too narrow, part 8. In an attempt to show how this theory works, this time we still have a 50mm lens and the aperture is still set to f5.6, but the distance to subject has been severely decreased to 0.5 meter. Now the red text tells us that the depth of field is now 3 centimeters or 0.03 of a meter, and that the sharp area is still located where the blue lines converge. This time the angle on the blue lines is very sharp, so they only stay together briefly. 3 centimeters in fact. You can test this with your own eyes. Hold your finger out at arm's length and slowly bring back towards your face. As you get closer, your eyes have to squint to be able to keep the finger in focus. This is the same action that the blue line has to follow. Depth of field too narrow, part 9. In the final diagram, we have the 50mm lens and the distance to subject of 0.5 of a meter, and we have opened the aperture right up to f2.8. The depth of field is now 2 centimeters or 0.02 of a meter, but this time the angle on the blue lines is extremely sharp, so they only stay together for 2 centimeters. Having seen these drawings, you can now see what would happen here if we were to move the subject even closer. Now you know the theory of depth of field and why it is so hard to manage at such close distances, i.e. macro photography. I actually emailed Martin Bailey many years ago for permission to use his images. His response was yes, and good luck explaining it. This is so very true and has to be the hardest thing in photography. However, once you understand it, there is no stopping you. High ISO and cropping. Many of you may wonder why I have included ISO and cropping into a sharpness tutorial. However, as any wildlife or macro photographer will testify, You often can't get close to a subject and the light is low, so a higher ISO is needed to get a sharp shot. When your images are processed and you end up having to crop an image substantially to get a favorable result, you magnify the effects of the noise in the image, and in many cases this affects sharpness. To this end, I do not shoot wildlife in anything other than ISO 100, and if I cannot use this setting, I will forego the shot rather than be disappointed later. You can see by the two images to the right that high ISO on the left can severely affect the sharpness of an image, especially when cropped into. This is a personal choice and entirely up to the photographer whether to use high ISO or not. In reality, it definitely depends on the circumstances of the shot. Missed focus or focusing on the wrong subject. Part 1. This is a very common problem and is undoubtedly caused by a lack of understanding of your camera's focusing system. Anyone who always uses their camera on multi-point focusing mode will most likely have experienced this problem. So why is this a problem? The multi-point or all-point focusing mode, regardless of how many focus points your camera has, will always focus on the closest subject that falls under one of the focusing points. In this particular case, it is the tree that is in focus and not the subject, provided that there is enough contrast for it to work. The camera will not be able to focus on subjects that have no contrast, such as a white wall or other plain areas. The problem with using this mode is that the camera does not know what you need to focus on, so therefore chooses the closest, and this may not be what you want in focus. Obviously, this becomes even more of an issue when you have only a narrow depth of field to work with. Missed focus or focusing on the wrong subject. Part 2. The image here is an example of what can happen when a multi-point focus is used in a situation where it doesn't work as the photographer wants it to. The issue here is that this can happen in any focus mode. This has also been made more obvious because the dog is very close to the camera and the depth of field is very small, making the eye even more blurred. Obviously, the dog's nose has high contrast, therefore the camera has focused on it, as it is the closest high contrast object under the multiple focusing points. So, there are three options that would have allowed the photographer to focus this image correctly. The easiest and least sophisticated option would be to switch to manual focusing and focus on the eye. However, this may not be an easy task if the dog is moving its head around. The second option would be to use a single focus point and move the point of focus over the dog's eye in any auto mode, but again difficult if the dog keeps moving. Option 3 is on the following slide. What a waste of depth of field. Obviously, the dog's nose has high contrast, therefore the camera has focused on it, as it is the closest high contrast object under the multiple focusing points. This has wasted a lot of the depth of field because it extends both in front of and behind the focus point. All of the depth of field at this side of the focus point is in front of the dog's nose and is wasted. So, there are options that would have allowed the photographer to focus this image correctly. See previous slide for options 1 and 2. 3. Close down the aperture or get further away and then zoom in and take the image as in the previous paragraph. Don't be fooled by focal length. This does not affect depth of field like you have been told. No, all it does is zoom in on the depth of field that was already there, making it look like it has changed, but in reality it has not changed at all. Missed focus or the wrong focus mode is being used. I photograph wildlife. I always have my camera set with only the center point activated and on AI focus mode. But this can also create problems when you don't have an understanding of how the system works. The two images here are taken with only the center focus point active. The girl who is in the center has been moved to the right third of the image to create a better composition, but she has moved away from the center focus point, which is on AI servo or AI focus. Because that focus point is now on the background trees, the camera has done what it has been instructed to do and has refocused on those trees, and now the subject is blurred and outside of the depth of field. The choices to rectify this are similar to the previous slides. What I would do is switch to single shot mode, then focus on the girl. That way when she moves, as long as I keep the shutter half pressed, she will stay in focus. Also note that it is also likely that the multi-point focus would have worked correctly in this shot because the girl is the closest to the camera, and the depth of field from this distance is likely enough to keep the subject entirely in focus provided she is still under at least one multi-focus point. If she isn't, then it will not work, as well as a tracking option when in the 61-point auto mode. Focus modes and focus points. It is always a good idea to take control of the focus points in the camera's viewfinder. Cameras vary, and here are the focus points from a 700D and a 7D. The 700D is limited to 9 points, multi-point, or single individual points of which only one point can be selected at any one time. The 7D has more points which can be selected as the 700D, with the inclusion of several modes which allow different patterns to be selected. This is the 5D Mk3 focus points, and exactly as the other two cameras, each point can be set as a single point. However, the camera also has a number of modes which allow combinations of points to be active, as well as a tracking option when in the 61-point auto mode. Canon's different focusing modes. So the previous section leads us nicely into this section where we will look at the focus modes. Focus modes are different from focus points, but they work together to achieve a successful shot. The focus points are where the camera will focus. The focus modes are how those points work. Separate from the focusing point settings is the focus modes, and in Canon cameras they are one-shot, AI focus, and AI servo. Most cameras have something similar and may be named differently, but here is a quick description of what they do. One shot. This is a static mode that retains the focus even if the camera is moved away from the original focus point, provided that the shutter button remains half pressed. This mode is useful for static subjects that won't move after focus is achieved, such as portraits and landscapes. AI focus. Best used with a single focus point. This is the first of two dynamic focus modes, and it is chiefly used for subjects that may move around in the same area, such as a bird hopping around the branches of a tree. The focus will stay on the object provided that the point that achieved the original focus is kept on the subject. AI servo. Again, best used with a single focus point. This is a similar mode to AI focus, but is used where the subject may be moving around, with the addition of being able to track the subject if it moves towards or away from the camera, as long as the focus point is kept on the subject. So why can these modes get you into trouble when they are used incorrectly? How one-shot mode works. Let's take the photograph we looked at previously with the girl and the trees in the background. If we have the girl positioned in the center of the shot and the focus mode on the camera set onto one shot, with just the center point active. If we then half-press the shutter to lock the focus and then ask the girl to move slightly to the right or move the camera left a little, to get a better composition and take the shot all as well, and as long as the shutter is kept half to press, the girl remains in focus. If you let go of the shutter at any time, the camera will refocus onto whatever falls under the central dot, and in this case the background trees. If we change the settings slightly so that the camera is set on AI focus or AI servo instead of one shot and rerun this scenario, we find that as soon as the girl steps away from the focus point, the camera automatically refocuses on the trees in the background, which is what they are designed to do. Focusing system set to AI servo mode. As an alternative scenario to the one above, let's look at a photograph of a person running towards the camera. If we imagine the girl positioned in the center of the shot and the focus mode on the camera set onto one shot, with just the center point active. We then again half-press the shutter to lock the focus, but this time ask the girl to run towards the camera. She will run out of the depth of field of the focus point, and we will no longer have focus on her, resulting in a blurred subject. The longer we take, the more blurred she will be. However, if the camera setting is changed again to AI servo, and the girl again runs towards the camera, the focus mode will keep the focus on the girl as long as the focus point stays on her and the shutter remains half-pressed. The half-press tells the camera to focus. Camera 2 close to the subject. On the odd occasion, usually during close-up or macro photography, we can have a scenario where the camera cannot attain focus because it is closer to the subject than the minimum focusing distance for the lens that is in use. Normally, this isn't a problem because there is a setting in the camera that says that the shutter cannot be released without first attaining focus. However, in some DSLRs this setting can be overridden and the shutter can be released without first achieving focus on the subject. Once the setting is overridden, then it can apply to all scenarios because the shutter can be pressed whilst the lens is still acquiring focus, resulting in a blurred image. Always check the minimum focus distance of your lens and make sure you can attain focus before pressing your shutter. If you can't get close enough, use an extension tube or a different lens. Otherwise, you can set the no photo unless focus is achieved setting in the camera options. A word on image stabilization and tripods. Many camera lenses come with some kind of lens stabilization technology. It's usually called something different by every camera manufacturer. For e.g. Nikon calls it vibration reduction, VR, and Canon calls it image stabilization, IS, but they all have the same goal, which is helping to stabilize your lens and reduce shake. Some manufacturers choose to place it in the camera body, and this has the advantage of working with all of your lenses. It works great for those times when you're forced to handhold your camera, but you should always make sure you turn it off when your camera is on a tripod. The stabilization technology works by unlocking part of your lens, which allows the lens to correct movements. The in-camera systems work by moving the sensor around to stabilize the image. But when your camera is sitting still on a tripod, the stabilizer will often look for movement that isn't there, resulting in a blurry photo. To illustrate this, take a look at the two photos. For both shots, the camera was locked onto a stable tripod. In the image on the left, The lens stabilization is turned off. Then it's simply turned on for the image on the right. However, a word of warning. Canon state that they use IS in the lens and not the camera body because every lens is different. It allows them to tune the IS for different lenses. What this means to you and I is that not all lenses will behave the same way, so some may work on a tripod whilst others may not. The best way to find out is to try it for yourself. That is the end of the sharpness tutorial. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video. Any questions? Put them in the comments area, please. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.